What happens when a continent collapses under the weight of its own past? Europe is a more ambiguous term than most geographic expressions. The Middle Ages saw Europe forge a new identity as a collection of individual nations, no longer part of Roman Empire. During Middle Ages, many European nations struggled to replace the protection of Rome with their homegrown strength. War, plague, and darkness once swept through Europe, but out of the chaos, something extraordinary was born. A revival, a rebirth. This is the story of how Europe came back to life. This is the rebirth of Europe. Before Europe could be reborn, it had to fall. Much of the Roman Empire's work of civilization started getting lost in internal and external wars. In 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire collapsed. Roads crumbled, cities emptied, trade routes vanished. It was the end of centralized power, the end of unity, and for many, the beginning of what we call the Dark Ages. It was under Roman Empire that the Christianity penetrated into Europe. Churches became a complementary body upholding the state. Churches became a stabilizing forces throughout the Europe. By winning recognition as the religion of the state, churches added a new basic factor of equality and unification to the imperial civilization, and at the same time reintroduced Middle Eastern and Hellenistic elements into the West. Moreover, during the period of the decline of secular culture, Christianity and the Church were the sole forces to arouse fresh creative strength by assimilating the civilization of the ancient world and transmitting it to the Middle Ages. At the same time, the Church in the West showed reserve toward the speculative dogma of the Middle Eastern and Hellenic worlds and directed its attention more toward questions of morality and order. When the Western Empire collapsed and the use of Greek had died there, the division between East and West became still sharper. The name Romaeoi remained attached to the Greeks of the Eastern Empire, while in the West the word Roman developed a new meaning in connection with the Church and the Bishop of Rome. Christianity and a Church of a Roman character, the most enduring legacy of the ancient world, became one of the most important features in Western European civilization. While chaos reigned in some regions, seeds of survival and adaptation were being planted. Small kingdoms emerged, and in places like Ireland and the Byzantine Empire, knowledge was preserved, waiting to be rediscovered. During late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, political, social, economic, and cultural structures were profoundly reorganized, as Roman imperial traditions gave way to those of the Germanic peoples who established kingdoms in the former Western Empire. New forms of political leadership were introduced, the population of Europe was gradually Christianized, and monasticism was established as the ideal form of religious life. By the 8th and 9th centuries, change was stirring. The Carolingian Renaissance, led by Charlemagne, revived learning and law. There was a sharp break from medieval values and institutions, a new awareness of the individual, an awakened interest in the material world and nature, and a recovery of the cultural heritage of ancient Greece and Rome. Meanwhile, Vikings raided and traded, connecting cultures from Scandinavia to Constantinople. The cultural exchange with the Vikings enriched European art, language, and mythology. These weren't isolated events, they were sparks, and together, they began to light the fire of European revival. The Vikings, known for their feared raids, also played a significant role in the development of trade and culture. Their seafaring skills and their ability to settle in different regions of Europe had a lasting impact on the political and social structure of the continent. Viking raids shaped the security and defense strategies of many European kingdoms. The Vikings contributed to political development and the formation of new ruling structures. In the 11th century, the Crusades began, a series of religious wars that sent Europeans to the Middle East. But despite their bloody intentions, the Crusades sparked an unintended consequence: cultural exchange. Europeans came into contact with the advanced civilizations of the Islamic world, bringing back medicine, mathematics, science, and forgotten texts. This wasn't just war, it was a transfer of knowledge. The medieval period in Europe was a time of remarkable progress. If science was taking steps forward in the rest of the world, in Europe it was doing leaps. Medicine, literature, architecture, physics, astronomy, human rights, maths, and more exploded in Europe as universities began emerging from Prague to Paris, connecting and sharing notes. Medieval Europeans copied from Arabs, which Arabs had copied from Indians. Even the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, was exotic to most Europeans. Much of the outside ideas entered Europe via the Arabs in Spain or the Normans in formerly Arab Sicily. The Crusaders also brought back ideas, again from the Arabs. Often the Eastern Christians were the intermediaries. With expansion, rivalry between towns grew, expanding into the neighboring with the smaller and weaker towns submitting to the domination of the larger and stronger. As the activity of the towns became more complex, sporadic collective action was replaced by permanent civic institutions. This led to the spread of power beyond the walls of the city to the neighboring towns. The idea of popular sovereignty existed in political thought and was reflected in the practice of calling a mass meeting of the populace in times of emergency. But in none of the republics were the people as a whole admitted to regular participation in government. On the other hand, the 13th century saw the establishment, after considerable struggle, of assemblies in which some portion of the male citizenry, restricted by property and other qualifications, took part in debate, legislation, and the selection of officials. Then came devastation. In the 14th century, the Black Death swept through Europe, killing nearly a third of the population. But from tragedy came transformation. The Black Death had numerous consequences, including a decline in trade, a drastic reduction in cultivated land due to the deaths of laborers, and a rise in wages for artisans and peasants. These changes brought a new fluidity to the rigid stratification of society. Psychological effects included a preoccupation with death and the afterlife, reflected in art and literature. Religious beliefs shifted, and anti-Semitism intensified as Jewish communities were blamed for the plague's spread. With fewer workers, peasants demanded better wages. Old systems began to break down. A new middle class started to rise. During plague epidemics, plague doctors were hired by towns to treat infected patients. They are known for their unique costume of a long waxed coat, gloves, hat, and a beaked mask filled with strong-smelling herbs and flowers to ward off miasma, or bad-smelling air. The chief method of combating plague was to isolate known or suspected cases as well as persons who had been in contact with them. The Black Death had a significant, albeit temporary, impact on European trade. Immediately following the violent outbreak of the plague, trade experienced a sudden slump. However, this cessation of trade was short-lived. And then, the Renaissance, the literal rebirth. It began in Italy in the 14th century and soon spread across the continent. This was a revolution in art, science, and thought. Artists explored realism and emotion. Scientists questioned old truths. And thinkers like Petrarch, Erasmus, and later Galileo and Newton changed how we saw the world and our place in it. The rise of humanism, an intellectual movement that emphasized human beings and their accomplishments rather than solely focusing on religion, was central to the Renaissance. The Renaissance brought an increased awareness of the individual, which was reflected in art, literature, and philosophy. The artist transformed from an anonymous craftsman to an individual practicing an intellectual pursuit. New technologies like paper and printing were widely adopted, facilitating the spread of knowledge. The development of printing with movable metal type was a communications revolution that enhanced opportunities for enlightenment. The 16th century was a period of vigorous economic expansion. This expansion in turn played a major role in many other transformations, social, political, and cultural, of the early modern age. The rebirth of Europe laid the foundations for the modern world. Democracy, science, humanism, capitalism, all of it traces back to the revival that emerged from centuries of struggle. From the ashes of Rome to the glory of the Renaissance, the rebirth of Europe reminds us, even in the darkest of times, light can rise again. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey through time, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, what period of European history should we explore next?